On the damp morning of November 14th, 1989, the old auction bell rang across a gravel lot outside Leon, Decatur County, Iowa, but nobody stepped forward. A cold wind carried the smell of harvested corn across 160 acres that had belonged to the Henderson family since 1938. The maple trees along the driveway had already surrendered most of their leaves. What remained clung stubbornly to black branches, rattling against one another as though they understood something the people gathered there did not. Near the porch stood Margaret Henderson, 74 years old, wrapped in a faded brown coat that had once belonged to her husband, Eli. She held a pair of worn leather gloves in both hands, instead of wearing them. They had been Eli's favorite gloves. Even after 3 winters without him, she still carried them whenever she faced something difficult. The auctioneer unfolded a sheet of paper. The opening bid is $82,000. Silence, not hesitation. Silence. Nearly 60 people stood around the yard. Local farmers, equipment dealers, bank representatives, curious neighbors. Boots shifted in the gravel. Coffee steamed from paper cups. Nobody raised a hand, because everyone already knew something. The soil hadn't produced a profitable harvest in years. The drainage ditches kept collapsing every spring. The western pasture flooded after heavy rain. The barns leaned just enough to frighten insurance inspectors. People around Decatur County had quietly begun calling it the widow's burden. Nobody wanted it. Margaret never looked toward the crowd. She kept watching the old machine shed instead. Inside that weathered wooden building rested a tractor that hadn't left the farm in almost 6 years. A 1951 Farmall M, 44 drawbar horsepower, weighing just over 5,000 pounds, purchased new in March 1951 from a dealership in Osceola, Iowa, for $2,176. Its red paint had faded almost to rust. Its seat had been patched with stitched leather. Its steering wheel shone smooth from decades of work. Most people saw scrap iron. Margaret saw 50 harvests. Let me tell you about Eli Henderson. He wasn't the loudest farmer in Decatur County. He rarely argued, rarely complained. Neighbors remembered him because he listened longer than he spoke. His hands were permanently stained with grease that ordinary soap never removed. Every Sunday morning, after church, he wiped down the farmer with an old cotton cloth before sitting on the porch with Margaret. He used to say machines remembered the people who cared for them. Most folks laughed when they heard that. Margaret never did, because she had watched that tractor pull wagons through mud deep enough to swallow horses. She had watched it power a threshing machine during the wet autumn of 1965, when newer tractors kept overheating. She had watched Eli rebuild his engine in 1978, replacing every piston ring by hand over 14 winter evenings inside the machine shed while snow piled against the doors. He never rushed. Neither did the tractor. After Eli died from a heart attack in April 1986, Margaret couldn't bring herself to sell it. The bank encouraged her. Neighbors suggested it. Equipment buyers offered cash. Every offer received exactly the same answer. No. 3 simple letters. No explanations. No negotiations. Just no. The problem was that memories could not pay operating loans. By the summer of 1989, unpaid interest had reached $11,840. Property taxes were overdue. The mortgage, first signed 23 years earlier, had become impossible for Margaret to carry alone. That was why today's auction existed. Not because she wanted to leave, because numbers eventually caught even the strongest people. Parked beside the county road sat a spotless black pickup truck. Leaning against it was Richard Collins, 38 years old, regional agricultural lending manager for the local bank. Pressed boots, clean denim jacket, gold wristwatch, confident smile. He studied the farm with the certainty of a man who believed every acre could be measured only by spreadsheets. Beside him stood several younger investors discussing how expensive it would be to bulldoze the old barns. Richard chuckled softly. "If this place sells at all," he said, "it'll be for the land. Everything else belongs in a scrapyard." Margaret heard every word. She didn't answer. She simply looked toward the old machine shed again. And at that exact moment, a small yellow school bus stopped beside the gravel road. The bus door folded open with sharp hiss that echoed across the quiet yard. Several heads turned. A little girl stepped carefully onto the gravel, clutching a worn blue backpack against her chest. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Her brown hair was tied into 2 uneven braids, and her oversized red coat looked as though it belonged to an older cousin. She paused for a moment, scanning the crowd until her eyes found Margaret. Then she smiled. "Grandma." Margaret's face softened for the first time that morning. The girl hurried across the yard and wrapped both arms around her waist. Margaret bent slowly, kissed the top of her head, and whispered something only the child could hear. Her name was Emily Henderson. She had come straight from school after convincing her teacher that she needed to be with her grandmother. No one expected her to stay. Children didn't belong at foreclosure auctions. At least, that was what most of the adults believed. The auctioneer cleared his throat once more. $82,000, he called again. "Do I have an opening bid?" Nothing. Only the wind answered. Richard Collins folded his arms. "I told you," he muttered to the men beside him. "Nobody's going to touch this place." One of the investors nodded. The drainage alone would cost $40,000 to repair. Another pointed toward the machine shed. "And that old Farmall? I'd pay more for the tires and the tractor." A ripple of laughter spread through the small group. Not cruel, not angry, just the kind of confident laughter that comes from people who believe they've already figured everything out. Margaret heard it. So did Emily. The little girl looked toward the shed, then back at the men laughing. She frowned. "Grandma," she whispered, "why are they laughing at Grandpa's tractor?" Margaret rested one gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Because they only see what it is today." Emily tilted her head. "What did Grandpa see?" Margaret smiled faintly. He saw what it could still do. "Let me tell you about that 1951 Farmall M. It wasn't valuable because collectors wanted it. It was valuable because Eli Henderson never treated it like a machine that would someday be replaced. Every autumn, he changed the oil before the first frost. Every spring, he greased every fitting, even the ones hidden beneath layers of dust. When a bearing began making the slightest noise, he replaced it before it failed. He believed maintenance wasn't expense. It was gratitude. By 1989, many newer tractors on neighboring farms had already been traded in twice. The Farmall remained. Older, slower, still dependable. There's a lesson hidden inside old cast iron. People often confuse horsepower with pulling ability, but they're not the same thing. Horsepower tells you how quickly an engine can do work. Torque is what keeps that work moving when the load becomes heavy. That's why older tractors like the Farmall M earn such loyal reputations. Their long-stroke engines produce steady torque at low engine speeds. They didn't race through a field. They leaned into it. They kept pulling when faster machines began spinning their wheels. Sometimes strength isn't about speed at all. Sometimes it's about refusing to quit. Emily listened carefully as Margaret looked toward the tractor. "It's still waiting," Margaret said quietly. "For what?" "For someone who remembers why it was built." The auctioneer raised his voice again. "Last call, $82,000. Silence. Richard stepped forward, hands in his pockets. "I think we've seen enough," he said confidently. "The bank will take possession. We'll list the land next spring." Several men nodded in agreement. One even started walking back toward his pickup. The decision seemed finished. The farm, the house, the barns, the tractor, everything. Then Richard glanced down and noticed Emily still standing beside her grandmother. He smiled politely. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he said. "Someone will find a better use for this place." Emily looked straight into his eyes. "What if it's already being used the best way?" A few people chuckled. Richard laughed louder than anyone. It wasn't a hateful laugh. It was a laugh of a man completely certain that a child couldn't possibly understand business. The sound carried across the quiet yard. Every face turned. Margaret never flinched. She simply squeezed Emily's hand. The little girl looked at the auctioneer. Then, with every adult watching, she slowly raised her hand. The laughter drifted across the auction yard like dry leaves in the November wind. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Emily's small hand remained raised. The auctioneer stared at her, unsure whether to smile or to continue the sale. Richard Collins let out another laugh, louder this time. Several investors joined him. One man shook his head, while another nudged his friend with his elbow. A 10-year-old wants to buy 160 acres? Richard said, smiling broadly, "Young lady, this isn't a lemonade stand." More laughter rolled through the crowd. Not everyone laughed. Some lowered their eyes. Some looked toward Margaret, who stood perfectly still beside her granddaughter. Emily slowly lowered her hand. She looked embarrassed for only a moment. Then she looked at her grandmother. "Grandpa always said," she whispered, "if something matters, you shouldn't be afraid to stand up first." Margaret smiled. That's exactly what he said. The smile disappeared from Richard's face. He wasn't expecting confidence, especially not from a child. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, young lady. State law requires a legal bidder." Emily nodded politely. "I know." Her answer surprised everyone. "But I wanted everyone to know somebody still wanted this farm." Silence returned. This time it felt different. Let me tell you about Walter Briggs. Walter was 76 years old. His farm touched the Henderson property on the northern fence line. He had planted soybeans beside Eli Henderson for almost 35 seasons. They had shared machinery, shared fuel, shared coffee, shared bad weather. Walter understood something that very few people in that auction yard understood. Eli Henderson had never been poor because he was careless. He had become poor because he refused to strip the land for quick money. During the late 1970s, when corn prices were high, many farmers pushed every acre they could. Eli didn't. He left timber standing. He rotated crops even when accountants said it reduced profits. He repaired drainage naturally instead of cutting wider ditches that would wash away topsoil. Neighbors called him old-fashioned. Walter called him patient. Richard stepped toward Margaret. "I'm sorry," he said, trying to sound sympathetic. "The bank gave every extension we legally could." Margaret nodded. "I know. You understand we have responsibilities." "I know. We're simply following procedure." Again, "I know." Richard frowned. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't crying. She wasn't blaming anyone. That somehow made the conversation harder. Walter slowly walked across the gravel yard. His boots crunched loudly enough that people turned toward him. He stopped beside Richard. "You know what your problem is?" Walter asked calmly. Richard folded his arms. "I imagine you're about to tell me. You think you're buying dirt." Several men exchanged puzzled looks. Walter pointed toward the field stretching beyond the barns. "No, you're standing on 40 years of someone else's decisions." Richard shrugged. "The soil reports aren't impressive." Walter smiled. "Soil reports only measure what they know to measure." Richard almost laughed again. "With respect, Walter, dirt is dirt." Walter's weathered face remained completely calm. "No, dirt is what blows away. Soil remembers." The older farmers quietly nodded. The younger investors looked confused. "Let me tell you about something Eli never wrote down." Every February, after the ground froze hard enough to carry a truck, he spread crushed limestone from a small quarry near Houston. Not because anyone told him to, because his father had taught him that healthy ground feeds itself long before it feeds people. Year after year, decade after decade, those small decisions never appeared on balance sheets. Banks couldn't calculate them. Auction catalogs never mentioned them. But the land remembered everyone. Richard looked across the western pasture. "It still floods." Walter answered immediately, "Only because nobody cleaned the original spring after Eli died." Richard blinked. "What spring?" Walter pointed toward a line of old cottonwood trees nearly half a mile away. "The underground spring." "The county maps don't show one." Walter chuckled softly. "The county maps were made by men. The spring was made by God." Several people smiled. Others simply stared. Richard looked unconvinced. "If there's really a spring, why hasn't anyone used it?" Walter looked toward Margaret. "Because only Eli knew exactly where it was." Emily suddenly tugged on her grandmother's sleeve. "Grandma." Margaret looked down. "I remember." Walter turned quickly. "You remember what?" Emily reached into her backpack. I found something when Mom was cleaning Grandpa's bedroom. She pulled out a small, weathered envelope. Its corners were worn. Its paper had turned deep yellow with age. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, were 6 simple words. Open only if the farm is lost. Every conversation stopped. Even Richard Collins forgot what he was about to say. Margaret stared at the handwriting. Her eyes filled with tears before she ever touched the envelope, because she recognized it instantly. It was Eli's, and whatever was inside had been waiting for this exact day. Margaret held the envelope as though it weighed far more than a few sheets of paper. For a long moment, she couldn't bring herself to break the seal. The handwriting belonged to Eli. She had watched those same steady hands write birthday cards, seed orders, and notes tucked inside lunch pails for more than 50 years. Emily looked up. "Grandma?" Margaret nodded slowly. "I think your grandpa knew this day might come." She carefully opened the envelope. Inside were 3 folded pages, a faded county survey map dated June 1952, and a small brass key tied with twine. The crowd gathered closer, without anyone asking them to. Even Richard Collins stepped forward. Margaret unfolded the first page. Her voice trembled as she began to read. "If you're reading this, then the farm has reached a day I prayed would never come. If I'm gone, don't waste time blaming anyone. Land has survived droughts, wars, and bankers long before us. It will survive this too." Nobody spoke. The answer isn't in the house. It isn't in the barn. It's where my father told me to look when I was 12 years old. Walter's eyes widened. "My goodness." Margaret continued. "Follow the old limestone fence to the twin cottonwoods. Count 37 steps east. You'll find the spring that saved this farm during the drought of 1956. I covered it after newer drainage systems were installed, because I believed one day people would forget it existed." Richard frowned. "A hidden spring?" Walter smiled without taking his eyes off the letter. "I told you." Margaret turned to the second page. There, in Eli's careful handwriting, was something nobody expected: a list of soil test results. Every 5 years, from 1964 through 1984, organic matter percentages, moisture readings, mineral content, crop rotation notes, even rainfall totals. Richard quietly took the pages. His expression changed with every line. "This can't be right." Walter looked over his shoulder. "It is." Richard pointed to one column. "The organic matter is nearly double the county average." Walter nodded. "Eli built soil instead of mining it." The younger investors looked at one another. One finally asked, "Does that really matter?" Walter answered before anyone else could. "It matters for every crop that will ever grow here. Let me tell you about healthy soil. People often think fertile ground is created in a single season. It isn't. Real soil is built over decades. Every crop residue left behind, every cover crop planted, every earthworm protected, every year without unnecessary erosion. Those invisible choices slowly create ground that holds more water, resists drought, and feeds stronger plants. It's like earning trust. Quick to lose, slow to build. Eli had spent 40 years building something no auction catalog could list. Richard stared across the fields again. For the first time all morning, he wasn't looking at acreage. He was looking at possibility. Emily unfolded the old survey map. "Grandma, look." The faded ink showed a narrow blue line cutting across the western pasture. Next to it were 2 handwritten words: Living Spring. Richard looked confused. "The county maps don't show this." Walter chuckled. "Because Eli never wanted anyone filling it in." One of the contractors spoke up. "If there's really water under that pasture." Another finished his sentence. The drainage problem could disappear. Richard looked back at the foreclosure paperwork, still resting on the auction table. Everything suddenly felt unfinished. Margaret noticed the brass key. "What does this open?" Walter's eyes drifted toward the machine shed. There wasn't a lock on the tractor. "No." Emily smiled. "But there was one on Grandpa's toolbox." Without another word, the small group walked toward the weathered shed. The crowd followed. The heavy wooden doors groaned as Walter pulled them open. Dust floated through beams of afternoon sunlight. There it stood, The 1951 Farmall M, exactly where Eli had parked it 3 years earlier. Its faded red hood was coated with dust. Its rear tires had gone soft. Cobwebs stretched from the steering wheel to the dashboard. Yet somehow, it still looked ready. Margaret slipped the brass key into the old steel toolbox mounted beside the seat. The lock clicked. Inside lay neatly organized wrenches, grease guns, replacement spark plugs, an owner's manual worn, almost transparent from use, and beneath them, another envelope. Richard looked at Margaret. I think he expected us to find this one too. She unfolded the second letter. If you open the toolbox, then you found the spring map. Good. Now, there's one more thing people forgot. Walter leaned closer. The Farmall isn't parked because it quit. Emily smiled. I knew it. Margaret continued reading. It's parked because I wanted the engine left exactly as it was after harvest. Drain the old fuel. Fill the tank. Prime the carburetor twice. Check the oil. Then start her. Richard looked at the tractor. You really think it'll run after 3 years? Walter answered calmly. No. Richard raised an eyebrow. Walter smiled. I think it'll remind us what real machines were built to do. The crowd rolled the tractor into the afternoon sunlight. Emily climbed onto the steel seat. Walter poured fresh gasoline into the tank. Margaret checked the oil exactly as Eli had written. Richard stood silently beside them. No laughter, no confidence, only curiosity. Walter wrapped one weathered hand around the crank. He looked toward Emily. You ready? She nodded. Walter pulled upward. Nothing. He tried again. The engine coughed once. A puff of blue smoke escaped the exhaust. The crowd leaned forward. Walter gave the crank one final pull. The old Farmall shook violently. Then, deep beneath the hood, something began to turn that hadn't moved since the day Eli Henderson drove it into this very shed, and the sound that followed stopped every heart in the auction yard. The first sound wasn't a roar. It was a single, heavy thump, then another, then another. The old 1951 Farmall M coughed a cloud of blue smoke into the cold November air before settling into the slow, unmistakable rhythm that thousands of Iowa farmers had once known by heart. Pop, 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 pop. The entire auction yard fell silent. No one cheered. No one spoke. They simply listened. It was a sound of cast iron patience, and 50 years of careful hands refusing to be forgotten. Emily sat on the steel seat with both hands gripping the steering wheel, while Walter adjusted the throttle. Margaret closed her eyes. For just a moment, it sounded as if Eli were still somewhere nearby. Richard Collins stood frozen. Minutes earlier, he had called the tractor scrap. Now the machine he had dismissed was idling as smoothly as many tractors half its age. Walter smiled. I told you. Richard nodded slowly. You did. The older farmer climbed onto the drawbar and motioned for Emily to ease the clutch forward. The Farmall rolled out of the machine shed. Its tires flattened the same tracks Eli had driven hundreds of times before. Walter pointed toward the western pasture. Let's find that spring. Dozens of people followed the tractor across the field. The auction had completely stopped. Even the auctioneer walked behind them, carrying his clipboard under one arm. When they reached the twin cottonwood trees, Margaret unfolded Eli's faded map once more. 37 careful steps. Exactly as the letter instructed. Walter pushed a steel probe into the ground. The first attempt struck nothing. The second slid deeper. On the third, the rod suddenly dropped nearly 3 feet. Walter looked up. It's here. A small excavator belonging to one of the contractors was driven into the pasture. Nobody argued anymore. Everyone wanted to know whether Eli had truly hidden a spring beneath the field. Within 20 minutes, damp soil appeared, then gravel, then a trickle of crystal clear water. The trickle became a stream. The stream became a steady flow pouring from beneath the limestone, exactly where Eli had marked it decades before. Someone quietly whispered, "My God!" Richard removed his cap. He understood. The flooding had never been caused by poor land. It had been caused by a forgotten spring whose natural outlet had gradually become blocked after years of neglect. Properly restored, the water could once again drain exactly as Eli's father intended. One contractor shook his head. That changes everything. Another nodded. The drainage repairs won't cost $40,000. They'll cost a fraction of that. Richard looked across the Henderson farm. For the first time all day, he wasn't seeing a foreclosure. He was seeing one of the healthiest pieces of ground in the county. He walked toward Margaret. "I owe you an apology." She smiled gently. "No." I laughed. "Yes. I thought I knew this farm." "You knew the paperwork." Richard lowered his eyes. "I never knew the people." Walter placed one hand on Richard's shoulder. "Now you do." The bank officially suspended the auction that afternoon. Within 3 weeks, after updated land evaluations, corrected drainage assessments, and new conservation reports were completed, the foreclosure was withdrawn. A local agricultural preservation trust helped refinance the remaining balance. Neighbors volunteered equipment. Contractors donated labor. Farmers who had stood silently during the auction returned with tile, gravel, fencing materials, and seed. Nobody asked for recognition. They simply remembered who Eli Henderson had been. Emily became the first person to drive the Farmall back into the field that following spring. Walter sat beside her. Margaret watched from the porch with Eli's old gloves resting quietly in her lap. 5 years passed. Then 10. Then more. Margaret Henderson passed away peacefully in 2001 at the age of 86 in the same white farmhouse where she and Eli had raised their family. She was buried beside him beneath a large oak tree overlooking the western pasture. Emily inherited the farm. She never sold it. Instead, she continued Eli's crop rotation plans almost exactly as he had written them in his notebooks. The restored spring became part of a small conservation project studied by agricultural students from Iowa State University, who visited to learn how older farming knowledge often solved problems modern engineering overlooked. Richard Collins changed as well. He remained in banking, but he became known throughout southern Iowa for something unusual. Before approving or denying a farm loan, he insisted on walking the fields himself, not driving, walking. He wanted to see the soil, touch it, meet the family, hear the history. Whenever younger loan officers asked why he spent so much time on every farm, he always gave the same answer. Numbers tell you the value. People tell you the truth. The 1951 Farmall M never became a museum piece. Emily refused every collector's offer. Instead, every autumn it pulled a small wagon during the community harvest festival. Children climbed onto its steel seat. Grandparents smiled when they heard its slow heartbeat echo across the fairgrounds. Someone always asked how such an old tractor still worked. Emily always answered exactly the way her grandfather once had. Take care of a machine long enough, and one day it'll take care of you. Years later, Richard attended one of those festivals. He watched children laughing around the old Farmall. He watched Emily explain how her grandfather had hidden a spring because he believed someone would someday need to remember where it was. Then Richard noticed a little girl standing beside the tractor with her hand raised, pretending to bid at an imaginary auction. Everyone laughed, including Richard, but this time his laughter carried respect instead of pride. He had finally learned the lesson Eli Henderson left behind. Some inherit land, others inherit wisdom. The fortunate ones inherit both. Some things are worth more than money because they keep giving long after the people who built them are gone. If the story reminded you of someone who quietly kept going when everyone else had given up, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Maybe it was a grandparent, a neighbor, or an old machine that refused to quit. Those stories deserve to be remembered just as much as this one. And if you'd like to hear about the farmer in Missouri who hid a vintage threshing machine inside an abandoned limestone cave for nearly 12 years rather than let it be scrapped, make sure you join me for the next story. Some of the greatest chapters of rural America are still waiting to be told.